On a Thursday morning in March of 1962 in Meade County, Kansas, a farmer named Walter Briggs walked into the farmers' co-op in Fowler and asked for something that made Earl Hutchins put down his pencil. Sorghum seed, 200 acres worth. Earl was 53 years old and had worked that co-op for 21 years. He knew every farmer in Meade County by name, by acreage, and by what they planted. He looked at Walter across the counter. "Walter," he said carefully, "that's your flat ground off County Road 9, your best wheat ground." Walter nodded. Earl wrote up the order without another word. He was a professional. But when the bell above the door stopped ringing, he picked up the telephone on the wall and called Frank Collier at Collier Implement 2 blocks away. You're not going to believe what Walter Briggs just ordered. By noon, Frank had told 3 people. By evening, it was the main conversation at the diner on Main Street. And the following Sunday, when Walter walked into the First Lutheran Church in Fowler and took his usual pew in the 4th row, he felt the looks before he saw them. Word had gotten around. Walter Briggs was pulling his best ground out of wheat and planting sorghum. In Meade County in 1962, that was about as sensible as trading a tractor for a horse. Now let me tell you about the notebook, because that's where this story really starts. Walter's father, Glenn Briggs, had homesteaded 480 acres in southwest Kansas in 1903. Glenn had come from Missouri with a wagon and a deed and had broken the sod by hand. He'd survived the dry years of the 1910s, the wheat boom of the 1920s, and then the thing that nearly finished him, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. In 1934, when the dust storms rolled in from the west and the wheat died in the ground and half the county was loading furniture onto trucks and driving to California, Glenn Briggs did something that his neighbors thought was either brave or crazy. He planted 40 acres of sorghum. He'd read about it in a government pamphlet, learned that sorghum's roots went 3 and 4 feet deep into the subsoil, looking for moisture that shallow-rooted wheat could never find. Learned that when sorghum got too dry, it could shut itself down, go dormant, wait for rain, and come back. Wheat couldn't do that. Wheat just died. That 40 acres stood green in 1934, while every wheat field around it turned brown and blew away. The yields were poor. The price was poor. But it was something. And in 1934, something was everything. Glenn survived the Dust Bowl. Most of his neighbors didn't. In the winter of 1948, 2 years before he died, Glenn Briggs sat at his kitchen table and wrote everything down. Not his life story, not family history, just farming. What he'd learned in 45 years of working southwest Kansas ground. What worked and what didn't. Which crops survived the dry years and which ones died. He wrote for 3 evenings straight, filled 31 pages in a composition notebook in the small, careful handwriting of a man who had not had much schooling but understood exactly what he wanted to say. The last paragraph read, "The drought will come back. It always does in this part of Kansas. Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but it will come. When it does, remember what I learned. Wheat dies when the water stops. Sorghum finds water that wheat never knew was there. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late." Glenn died in 1950. The notebook went into the top drawer of his desk in the back bedroom, and there it stayed for 12 years. Walter found it in January of 1962. He wasn't looking for it. He was cleaning out the back bedroom to make room for his mother-in-law who was coming to stay, and he pulled open the desk drawer and saw his father's handwriting on the cover. Glenn Briggs, Farming Notes, 1948. He sat down on the edge of the bed and read every page. His wife Ruth found him there an hour later. She'd come to ask if he wanted coffee. She stopped in the doorway when she saw his face. "Walter, what's wrong?" He looked up. He held up the notebook. My father wrote all of it down. Everything he learned from the Dust Bowl. Everything he figured out about which crops survived the dry years. Ruth came in and sat beside him. She read the last paragraph. She read it twice. Then she looked at her husband. "He's talking about sorghum." Walter nodded. 200 acres of it, our best ground. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "The whole county plants wheat." "I know. They'll think you've lost your mind." Walter looked at the last paragraph again. His father's handwriting, small and careful. "Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late." He closed the notebook. "They thought my father had lost his mind in 1934, too." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to get the coffee. That was Ruth. She didn't say much when she'd already made up her mind. 2 months later, Walter walked into the farmer's co-op and ordered sorghum seed for 200 acres. Now let me tell you about Frank Collier, because Frank Collier was the voice of Meade County, and what Frank said, people heard. Frank owned Collier Implement on the highway south of Fowler, had owned it for 16 years, sold John Deere equipment to every serious farmer in the county. He was not a bad man. He was the kind of man who had been right about enough things for long enough that he'd stopped seriously considering being wrong. He drove out to Walter's farm on a Saturday in April, 3 weeks after planting. He stood at the fence on County Road 9 and looked at the rows of sorghum coming up in the ground where wheat should have been. Walter came out from the equipment shed and walked over. Frank looked at him. "Walter, wheat is over $2 a bushel right now, 2 years running." "I know what wheat is selling for." "Your father ran some sorghum, I know that. But your father ran 40 acres of it as a backup, not 200 acres of his best ground." Frank shook his head. "You're pulling your most productive acres out of the crop that's paying right now and putting them into a feed grain that's worth half as much. That's not farming, Walter. That's gambling." Walter looked at the field. The sorghum was barely an inch tall, pale green shoots against the dark Kansas soil. "My father wrote something down in 1948, he said, about what happens when the water stops." Frank turned to look at him. "The Dust Bowl was 30 years ago. We've got better equipment now, better seed, better everything." "The rain doesn't know that." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head and walked back to his truck. "Walter, I've sold equipment to every farmer in this county for 16 years. I know what works out here and what doesn't." He opened the truck door. "This doesn't work. You're going to have a long summer explaining this to your bank." He drove back to Fowler. That evening at the diner, he told anyone who would listen. Walter Briggs pulled his best wheat ground and planted sorghum, 200 acres, said his father wrote something about it. The men at the counter had their theories. Some said Walter was having money trouble. Some said he'd gotten bad wheat seeds somewhere and was covering his losses. Nobody thought it was a good idea. The nicknames started the following week. Not mean exactly, more like a footnote. Wrong Crop Walter, they called him. Said it with a small smile, like a punchline to a joke everyone already knew. "You see Wrong Crop Walter at the elevator? Still planting that sorghum." Some people just can't be helped. Walter heard it everywhere. He never corrected anyone. He went home and kept farming. Let me tell you about the morning Walter's son came in from school. It was October of 1963, the end of the second planting season. Walter's boy Daniel was 13 years old and had been hearing the nickname at school for a year and a half. He came in the back door one afternoon, and Ruth saw his face before he could say anything. "What happened?" It wasn't a question. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table. "Billy Collier said Dad doesn't know how to farm. Said his dad says we're going to lose the ground because Dad keeps planting the wrong crop." Ruth set down what she was holding. "What did you say?" Daniel looked at the table. "I didn't say anything." Walter came in from the equipment shed a few minutes later and found them sitting there. He looked at his son's face and understood immediately. He pulled out the chair across from Daniel and sat down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he stood up, went to the back bedroom, and came back with his father's notebook. He set it on the table between them. "Your grandfather wrote this in 1948, Walter said. "Sit with me." For the next hour, Walter read passages out loud. He read about the dust storms of 1934. He read about the neighbors who left for California and never came back. He read about the 40 acres of sorghum that stood green while every wheat field in the county was brown and blowing. He read the last paragraph twice. Daniel listened. He was 13 years old, and he was hearing this for the first time. "But Dad," Daniel said when Walter closed the notebook, "that was 30 years ago. Everyone says it won't happen again like that." Walter put his hand flat on the cover of the notebook. "Everyone said that in 1933, too, right up until it happened." Daniel looked at the notebook. "What if Grandpa Glenn was wrong? What if the drought doesn't come?" Walter looked at his son steadily. "Then I'll be the fool everyone says I am." He paused. "But if he was right, if the drought comes and we're the only ones who planted for it, we'll be the only family in this county still standing when it's over." He picked up the notebook. "I'd rather be wrong and ready than right and finished. Wouldn't you?" Daniel didn't answer. But that evening, Ruth found him in the back bedroom, sitting at his grandfather's old desk, reading the notebook from the beginning. Walter planted sorghum again the following spring, and the spring after that. Now let me tell you about the summer of 1966, because that's when Glenn Briggs reached across 16 years and proved he was right. The winter of 1965 had been dry. Not alarmingly dry, just dry in the way that old-timers in southwest Kansas recognized and talked about quietly among themselves. The subsoil moisture going into spring was low. March brought almost nothing. April brought 2 good rains and then stopped. May was hot and clear and relentless. By June, the wheat was struggling. Walter drove his county roads slowly that June, the way his father had taught him to drive them, reading what was actually there instead of what he hoped was there. The wheat fields around Fowler had a color that wheat wasn't supposed to have in June, not the rich dark green of a crop coming into its strength, but a pale, tired green that was one hot week away from yellow. He came home and walked out to his own fields, his wheat on the north section, pale, struggling. His sorghum on the flat ground off County Road 9, darker, thicker stalked, the plants drawing down into the subsoil for moisture that the wheat above couldn't find. He stood at the edge of the sorghum field for a long time. Ruth came out and stood beside him. "Howard," she said, "it looks all right." Walter nodded. He didn't say anything else. He went back inside and got his father's notebook out of the desk drawer and read the last paragraph one more time. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. He put the notebook back and went to bed. July was brutal. 17 days straight without measurable rainfall, temperatures running 7 and 8 degrees above normal. By the third week of July, the wheat fields of Meade County had taken on the color of straw, the stalks brittle and finished 3 weeks before harvest. In some fields, the heads were so light they barely bent the stalk. The grain wasn't there. Frank Collier drove out to his customers' farms that July and came back to Fowler looking like a man who had seen something he didn't want to have seen. He stopped at the co-op and talked to Earl Hutchins for a long time. Earl told people later that Frank had barely said 2 words in the first 5 minutes, just stood at the counter looking at his hands. Walter drove County Road 9 on the last day of July. He slowed at his own fence line and looked at both sides of the road. On the west side, his wheat, brown, finished. Maybe 8 bushels an acre if he was generous with himself. On the east side, his sorghum. The plants had thickened and darkened the way sorghum does under stress, sending everything downward, finding water 30 and 40 inches deep that the wheat roots could never have reached. The leaves had curled slightly in the heat, but they were green. The plants were alive. They were going to produce a crop. Walter sat in his truck for a long time without moving. Then he drove home and told Ruth they were going to be all right. Let me tell you about the harvest, because the numbers are what the county remembered. The 1966 wheat harvest in Meade County was the worst since the 1950s. The county average came in at 7 bushels per acre. Some fields did worse. A few careful farmers who had managed their ground well came in a little better. 7 bushels at $2.10 was $14.70 per acre, against operating costs of $16 to $18 per acre. That was a borrowing number. That was a call from the bank number. Walter's wheat came in at 9 bushels per acre. Better than average, still a loss. His sorghum came in at 73 bushels per acre. Glenn Mueller at the grain elevator watched Walter's truck pull onto the scale and looked at the ticket. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up. Sorghum. Walter nodded. Glenn shook his head slowly. Howard, I don't think I've weighed a sorghum load at this elevator in 4 years. He disappeared into his office to look up the price. When he came back, his expression had changed. Droughts hit the feedlots in Texas, too. Hay crop failed down there. He set the ticket on the counter. $3.40 a bushel. Walter looked at the number. He'd expected high. He hadn't expected that high. Glenn did the math on a piece of paper. 73 bushels times 340 times 200 acres. He wrote the number down and pushed it across the counter. Walter looked at it for a long moment. $49,000, Glenn said quietly. From sorghum. He paused. While your neighbors made nothing. Walter folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't say anything. Glenn leaned on the counter. Walter, I have to ask you something. You've been planting that sorghum for 4 years. Everyone thought you were wrong. How did you know? Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out his father's notebook. He set it on the counter. Glenn looked at the cover. Glenn Briggs, Farming Notes, 1948. My father wrote it all down, Walter said, after the Dust Bowl. Everything he learned. He put his hand on the cover. Last paragraph. Glenn opened the notebook and read the last paragraph. He read it twice. Then he looked up. He wrote this in 1948? Walter nodded. Glenn looked at the notebook for a long time. Then he looked at Walter. And you just believed him? He farmed this ground for 40 years, Walter said. He survived the worst drought this part of Kansas ever saw. He wrote down what he learned so somebody would remember. Walter picked up the notebook and put it back in his jacket. I figured the least I could do was read it. The news moved through Meade County the way drought news always moves, fast and with a particular weight to it. Walter Briggs harvested sorghum. Walter Briggs made $49,000. Walter Briggs planted the wrong crop for 4 years and turned out to be the only farmer in the county with money in his pocket. At the diner, at the co-op, at the church on Sunday, people looked at Walter differently. The small smile was gone. The footnote was gone. Wrong crop Walter was gone. What replaced it took a while to arrive, but meant more. Now let me tell you about Frank Collier, because what Frank did next tells you what kind of man he actually was underneath the certainty. Frank drove out to Walter's farm on a Saturday morning in November. He came alone. No customers, no son, nobody from the diner. He knocked on the door, and Ruth answered and brought him through to the kitchen. Walter was at the table with his harvest records. He looked up when Frank came in. Frank had his hat in his hands, which Walter had never seen before in 16 years of knowing him. Walter. Frank sat down without being asked. He looked at the table for a moment. I owe you something. Walter waited. 4 years, Frank said. 4 years I stood at your fence and told you that you were wrong. I said it to your face, and I said it behind your back. He turned his hat in his hands. I told people at the diner. I told them at the implement show in Dodge City. Wrong crop Walter. He paused. I started that name. Walter looked at him. I know you did. Frank nodded. I was certain. That's the thing that I keep coming back to. I wasn't just disagreeing with you. I was certain, and I told anyone who would listen how certain I was. He looked up. And you were right the whole time. I wasn't right, Walter said. My father was right. Frank was quiet for a moment. Same thing, isn't it? Walter thought about that. He reached into his jacket and put the notebook on the table between them. Frank looked at the cover. He wrote it in 1948, Walter said, after the Dust Bowl. He watched his neighbors leave for California, and he swore he'd write down what he'd learned so somebody in this family would know what to do when it happened again. Frank reached out and touched the cover of the notebook, but didn't open it. He left that to Walter. Read the last paragraph, Walter said. Frank opened to the last page and read. He read it slowly. When he finished, he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late, Walter said. Frank set the notebook down carefully, the way you set something down when you understand it has weight. He looked at Walter. Can I ask you something? Walter nodded. When you found this, when you read it the first time, were you sure? Were you sure enough right then to plant 200 acres? Walter thought about it honestly. No, he said finally. I wasn't sure. I was just more afraid of being wrong about ignoring it than I was of being wrong about following it. Frank was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the fields lay bare and November gray, harvested and resting, the sorghum stubble on the east side of County Road 9 standing in rows that had fed this farm through the worst summer in 20 years. Frank put his hat back on and stood up. He extended his hand. Walter shook it. Frank looked at the notebook one more time. You going to keep planting it? Walter almost smiled. Every year. Frank nodded. Good. He walked to the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. I'm going to start stocking sorghum planting equipment, he said, in case anyone asks. He walked out into the November morning. Walter sat at the table for a while after he left. He picked up his father's notebook and read the last paragraph one more time, the way he'd read it 100 times by now, the way he would read it 100 times more. The words were the same as they'd always been. Plain. Certain. Written by a man who had paid for the knowledge with 5 years of dust and drought and neighbors disappearing down the highway to California. Walter put the notebook back in his jacket pocket, where he'd taken to carrying it during planting season. Then he went out to the equipment shed to winterize the sorghum planter for next year. Let me tell you about what happened in the years after, because this story doesn't end with one harvest. By 1970, 6 farms in Meade County were growing significant sorghum acreage. Not because Walter had campaigned for it, not because he'd given talks or written anything down, because farmers who remembered 1966 had done their own math and driven past County Road 9 enough times to understand what they were looking at. The dry years came again in 1971 and 1974. Both times, Walter's sorghum came through when the wheat didn't. Both times, the same story, different numbers. By 1974, the grain elevator in Fowler had expanded its sorghum storage, something Glenn Mueller had said would never make economic sense as recently as 1964. Frank Collier retired in 1978. At his retirement party at the VFW Hall, he gave a short speech. He thanked his customers. He thanked his family. And then he said one more thing. He said there was a farmer in the county who had tried something 16 years earlier that Frank had publicly said was wrong. He said the farmer's name, Walter Briggs. And he said he had been wrong and Walter had been right. And he wanted everyone in that room to know it. Then he sat down. Walter was there. He nodded once at Frank across the room. Frank nodded back. That was enough for both of them. Walter Briggs farmed those 480 acres until 1989, when he turned 70 and his body told him it was time to stop. He handed the operation to Daniel without ceremony. They walked the property together one last time, Walter pointing out things he wanted Daniel to remember. Where the drainage got soft in a wet spring, where the fence needed attention on the north side, where the soil was thin on the slope above the creek. At the sorghum ground on County Road 9, Walter stopped. Daniel, he said, you'll have years when the wheat price breaks your heart, and years when the sorghum disappoints you. He looked at the field. But you'll never get a year when the drought kills both of them at the same time. Sorghum finds water the wheat never knew was there. He reached into his jacket and took out the notebook. He held it for a moment, then handed it to Daniel. Your grandfather wrote that in 1948. He gave it to me when I needed it. Now I'm giving it to you. Daniel took it with both hands. Read the last paragraph every spring before you plant, Walter said. Every single spring. Walter Briggs died in 1997. He was 78 years old and had farmed until he was 70. The funeral was at the First Lutheran Church in Fowler, the same church where the looks had followed him in the spring of 1962 when everyone knew he'd ordered sorghum seed for his best wheat ground. Daniel spoke at the service. He was not a natural public speaker. He stood at the front of the church holding his grandfather's notebook, Glenn's notebook, the composition notebook with the small, careful handwriting, and looked out at the farmers and neighbors who had filled the pews. He said, "My father was not a complicated man. He didn't try to predict the future. He didn't have a system or a theory. He cleaned out a desk drawer in January of 1962 and found something his father had written 14 years earlier, and he decided to trust it. That's all. He trusted a dead man's words more than he trusted the crowd's opinion. And the crowd called him Wrong Crop Walter for 4 years because of it." Daniel opened the notebook to the last page. "My grandfather wrote this in 1948. He was 61 years old, and he'd just survived the worst thing that ever happened to farming in this part of Kansas. He sat at his kitchen table for 3 evenings and wrote down everything he'd learned so that someone in this family would know what to do when it happened again." Daniel looked down at the page. He read the last paragraph out loud. "The drought will come back. It always does in this part of Kansas. Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but it will come. When it does, remember what I learned. Wheat dies when the water stops. Sorghum finds water that wheat never knew was there. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. Daniel closed the notebook. My father read that paragraph in January of 1962, he said. That spring, he planted 200 acres of sorghum, and the county called him a fool. In 1966, the drought came, and his sorghum stood green on County Road 9, while the wheat fields around it went brown. He made $49,000. His neighbors made nothing. He paused. He never said, "I told you so." Not once. He just kept planting. Daniel looked at the congregation. This notebook saved this family. Not once, but every dry year since 1962. My grandfather wrote it. My father read it. I've read it more times than I can count. And someday, I'll give it to my own kids and tell them the same thing my father told me. He held up the notebook. Read the last paragraph every spring before you plant. Every single spring. Because the drought always comes. And when it does, you'd better already be ready. The Briggs farm is still in operation today. Daniel's daughter Karen runs it now, the fourth generation on that same ground. She plants wheat and sorghum in roughly the proportions her grandfather established in the 1960s. She has the notebook. Glenn's notebook. The composition book with the faded cover and the small, careful handwriting. The last paragraph that has been read by 4 generations of the same family in the same kitchen in Meade County, Kansas. Every spring before planting, Karen sits at the kitchen table, her great-grandfather's table, her grandfather's table, her father's table, and opens the notebook to the last page. She reads it to her own children now. The drought will come back. It always does. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. 4 generations of Briggs. 4 generations of reading those words. 4 generations of sorghum standing green on County Road 9 when the wheat fields went brown. That's what one notebook in a desk drawer can do. That's what happens when you trust the people who came before you. That's what Walter Briggs understood on a January morning in 1962 when he sat on the edge of a bed in the back bedroom and read his father's handwriting for the first time. Some knowledge costs everything to earn and nothing to pass on. You just have to be willing to read it. What stays with me about Walter is that moment in the back bedroom. He's cleaning out a desk drawer, not looking for anything, not expecting anything. And he finds 31 pages his father wrote 14 years earlier that nobody had ever bothered to read. 14 years that notebook sat in that drawer. 14 years it could have changed everything for the men who lost their farms in the dry years. But nobody opened it. Walter opened it. That one decision, to sit down and read what his father had written, that's the whole story. The knowledge was always there. Someone just finally had to be willing to find it. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop one word in the comments that describes Walter Briggs. Just one word. I want to see what you choose.